The courtroom was packed. The sound of the lawyer's heels echoed like a clock marking destiny. 10 years later, Laura, the absent mother, returned, not with tears, but with a briefcase full of evidence and the voice of someone who'd learned to lie while looking others straight in the eye. In the front row, Gabriel, blind, autistic, now 17 years old, kept his face turned forward, like someone listening to what others still couldn't hear. Her lawyer raised the papers and said that if nothing could be proven, custody and copyright of the boy's work could be transferred. That's when he leaned toward me, slowly, and whispered, "Let her talk." I froze, because I knew that sometimes, silence is the last refuge of truth. And no one there imagined what that voice had been holding for so many years. If this story touches something in you, subscribe and share it with someone who believes that time and truth always meet. Every gesture here keeps alive this house of faith, where pain transforms into memory, and memory into peace. My name is Helena. I'm 70 years old. I was a choir teacher for most of my life until the day sound stopped being just art and became survival. In 2011, my daughter Laura left little Gabriel with me for a weekend. It was Friday. The sky was copper-colored, and the smell of coffee still filled the kitchen when she walked out the door. The weekend ended, but she never came back. Gabriel was 6 years old, blind from birth and autistic. His world had no shapes or faces, only sounds. The creaking of the chair, the whistling of the kettle, the rhythmic tapping of my steps on the wooden floor. Everything about him was rhythm. Everything about him was precision. And each sound seemed to say, "I'm here." There was, on the table, a blue mug with a subtle crack. It was the coffee cup Laura left behind when she departed. I never threw it away. It was too fragile to serve, but strong enough to remember. On the first Christmas without her, silence seemed to cover everything, like heavy snow that no one could see. I cried while Gabriel, in silence, approached. He picked up the mug, touched his fingers to the crack and murmured, "It's still warm." That boy saw what no one else saw, and in that instant I understood. Love changes form. It stops being presence and becomes sound. Sound was all that remained of the two of us. And it was through sound that we began to learn how to continue. The first few months were difficult in a way that no one on the outside could understand. It wasn't the difficulty of caring, it was the difficulty of not knowing what calms. Gabriel would freeze when a door slammed. He'd cover his ears if a car honked outside. The television, even on mute, was unbearable for him. He said it buzzed like angry bees. I didn't understand yet, but I was learning. His world wasn't visual. It was auditory, and every unfamiliar sound was a threat. So I began to create a routine of sounds. Always the same sequence. Always at the same time. Coffee at 7, with the same tinkling of the spoon in the cup. At 8, I'd sit at the old piano my husband had left behind, an out-of-tune instrument, but faithful, and play simple scales. Nothing elaborate. Just the repetition of C major, going up and down like a conversation with silence. And Gabriel, in the corner of the room, would begin to murmur along. He didn't sing yet. He just accompanied, with his voice low, almost inaudible, like someone testing whether the world was still in place. One morning, I played a lullaby I used to sing to Laura when she was small. My fingers faltered on the keys. The memory weighed heavy. But Gabriel stood up slowly, walked over to me and placed his hand on mine, carefully, like touching glass. He didn't say anything for a while. He just stayed there, feeling the vibration of the piano under my fingers. "Don't stop, Grandma," he finally said. "This is teaching me something." "What is it teaching you, my love?" I asked, my voice nearly disappearing. He smiled, a rare smile, precious as water in the desert. "That sadness has music too." And it was in that moment I understood. Music wasn't just something that calmed him. It was the language he used to translate the world. Every note, every pause, every silence between sounds, all of it made sense to him in a way that words never would. He didn't need to see. He felt, and what he felt, he transformed into sound. That old piano, with yellowed keys and tired strings, became the bridge between us. And for the first time since Laura left, I felt that maybe, just maybe, The two of us were capable of building something new. Something that didn't depend on who left. Something that was just ours. When Gabriel turned 9, something changed. It wasn't sudden. It was like when dawn arrives slowly, without hurry, but inevitable. He no longer just accompanied the melodies I played. He absorbed them. He repeated with absolute perfection anything he heard just once. And it wasn't just the melody. It was the emotion, the intention, the weight of each note. Miss Evelyn, the music teacher at school, called me one rainy October afternoon. Her voice trembled, not with concern, but with something I couldn't yet name. "Helena," she said, "that boy doesn't just sing. He listens with his soul." She told me that Gabriel had repeated note for note, a complex piece by Bach that she'd played only once during class, without hesitation, without error, as if the music was already inside him, waiting just to be remembered. Miss Evelyn offered free lessons, vocal training, breath control, advanced ear training. I hesitated, because I knew the world could be cruel to those who are different. I knew people would look at Gabriel and see limitations before they saw possibilities. I was afraid he'd give his heart, and someone would trample it just because they didn't understand what they were seeing. Or rather, what they weren't seeing. But when I asked Gabriel if he wanted to learn, he didn't think twice. He tilted his head, the way he did when something made complete sense to him, and said, "Music doesn't look at me funny, Grandma. It just stays." And it was that word "stays" that made me say yes, because that was exactly what he needed. Something that would stay, something that wouldn't leave. His first recital was in a small chapel, old wood and terrible acoustics. I sat in the back, nervous, holding that cracked blue mug like an amulet capable of protecting him from any disappointment. Gabriel walked onto the stage without a cane, without help, just trusting that the space would be where it should be. He folded his hands in front of his body, waited for the pianist to begin, and when he opened his mouth, the world stopped. His voice was pure, crystalline. It didn't ask for applause, it asked for silence, and the silence came. People cried, not out of pity, not that condescending compassion that hurts more than it helps. They cried because they were touched, because something in that voice reached a place that words can't. Even the janitor, who was sweeping the hallway, stopped and stood in the doorway, leaning on his broom, eyes fixed on the stage. Miss Evelyn looked at me with tears streaming down her face and silently mouthed, "This is bigger than us." And I knew, with fear and faith intertwined like ancient roots, that my grandson had received something the world didn't deserve, but perhaps needed. Perhaps that voice existed precisely for this, to remind us that beauty doesn't need eyes to be seen. It just needs courage to be heard. Gabriel didn't just memorize songs. He memorized people. He recognized my footsteps before I even entered the room. He knew when I was sad by the way I stirred my tea too slowly, as if wanting to postpone the moment of drinking. Once, a man came to fix the porch light. Gabriel stayed in the kitchen, quiet, listening to the conversation. When the man left, he said, with that calm that always startled me, "He's lying, Grandma." His voice goes up at the end. I checked later. The man had charged me double for the service. Gabriel wasn't guessing. He was reading the world the only way he could. Through sound, rhythm, the spaces between words. He heard what no one else heard. The hesitations, the breaths out of place, the silences that said more than any sentence. That's when I began recording his rehearsals. I bought an old cassette recorder. One of those with two little wheels spinning and a red button that clicked when you pressed it. Miss Evelyn said it would be good for him to hear his own progress. But those tapes became something much bigger than that. They became proof that love sounds like patience, that growth sounds like repetition, that a boy who couldn't see was teaching the rest of us to truly listen. Each tape was a small time capsule, his voice changing, the melodies becoming more complex, the pauses more intentional. I kept everything in an old shoebox under the bed, not knowing that one day those recordings would speak louder than any lawyer ever could. Because truth has sound. And sound, when it's authentic, can't be faked, can't be bought, can't be claimed by someone who was never present to hear it. Gabriel understood the world through melody. and through melody, he began to tell his own story. A story that didn't yet have words, but already had a voice. Not everyone saw what I saw. Too many. Gabriel was just difficult to handle. An administrative problem. A logistical challenge that required resources the school didn't want to spend. When he was 10 years old, I received a call from the principal. Her voice was polite, but cold. They said Gabriel needed to be transferred to a specialized institution, that the regular school didn't have the structure to accommodate him appropriately. Translation: he was inconvenient. He required attention. He didn't fit into the box they'd prepared for normal children. I sat in that meeting room surrounded by people who spoke in acronyms, IEP, ADA, 504, and avoided looking me in the eyes. They talked about Gabriel as if he were a case, a number, a statistic that needed to be solved. I let them talk. Let them finish their well-rehearsed arguments, and then, with the calmest voice I could muster, I said, he doesn't need pity. He needs people who speak with their hearts, not their budgets. There was an uncomfortable silence, but I didn't back down. I demanded an individualized education plan. I demanded accommodations, not isolation. I demanded they see Gabriel as a child who learned differently, not as a problem that needed to be removed. And, reluctantly, they agreed. Gabriel stayed in the regular class, but he learned something that year that no school curriculum could teach, that the world listens poorly and talks too much. He learned that often inclusion is just a pretty word used by people who don't really want to include, but he also learned something more important, that he didn't need the world's approval to have value. He had a voice, and a voice doesn't need permission to exist. Gabriel began to speak less after that, but he sang more, because songs didn't judge, they just echoed. And sometimes, an echo is the only truth we need. There was a song that played on the radio in the afternoons, a soft ballad about mothers and children, about bonds that time doesn't undo. I never paid much attention, but Gabriel did. He would always stop whatever he was doing when it began. He'd just stay quiet, listening, as if each word were a revelation he didn't yet know how to process. One evening, after the song ended, he asked me the question I'd been dreading for years. We were in the kitchen. I was washing dishes. He was sitting at the table, fingers tracing the outline of the cracked blue mug. Grandma, ... double quotes, he began, slowly. Why did she leave? Time stopped. The water kept running in the sink, but I couldn't hear it anymore. My heart was beating so loud it seemed to muffle all other sounds. I could have lied, could have said she was sick, that she got lost, that she had some noble reason for leaving. But Gabriel deserved the truth, even if it hurt, maybe especially because it hurt. I turned off the faucet, dried my hands slowly, buying time. I sat beside him and held his hands, small, delicate, but strong, because she was afraid. My love, I said, my voice breaking, afraid of what she didn't understand, afraid of staying when things got hard. But her fear wasn't bigger than the love you deserve. He was silent for a long time, a heavy silence, full of things he still didn't know how to name. And then, softly, he began to sing. It wasn't a song I knew. It was just 2 words, repeated like a mantra. Love stays, ... double quotes. And in that moment, something inside me broke and healed at the same time. Because I realized, Gabriel understood the world through melody. And in his melodies, love wasn't complicated. It had no excuses. It had no middle ground. It was either present or it wasn't. There was no gray area. No, I wanted to, but I couldn't. There was only presence or absence. And he knew exactly which one I was. That 2-word song became the foundation of everything he would write afterward, because the deepest truth is always the simplest. And Gabriel had the gift of finding simplicity where the rest of us saw only confusion. When Gabriel turned 12, something changed again. He was no longer just singing other people's songs. He began composing his own. At first, they were just fragments, loose phrases, incomplete melodies that he'd murmur while walking through the house. But gradually, those fragments began to come together, to take shape, to tell stories. The themes were always the same, but never repetitive. Memory, time, voices that return with the wind. He wrote about things he couldn't see, but felt with a clarity that was startling. He wrote about the sound of rain hitting the window like tears. The house cried for him. About the ticking of the living room clock like a heart that refused to stop. About silence, that kind of silence that isn't the absence of sound, but the presence of something that hasn't yet been said. Miss Evelyn and I decided to create a YouTube channel for him. We didn't expect anything. We just wanted there to be a record, a place where those songs could exist beyond the walls of our house. We called the channel Echo of Light, because that's exactly what Gabriel was, an echo of something luminous that most people couldn't see, but that everyone could feel. We posted the first video on a Sunday afternoon. Gabriel, singing alone, accompanied only by the old piano. The camera was shaky, the lighting was poor. There was no editing, it was just him, the music, and the raw truth it carried. I thought maybe my sister in Tallahassee would watch it, maybe some teachers, maybe no one. But 3 weeks later, I received a message from a stranger, a music producer from Atlanta named Marcus Reed. The message was short, but loaded with an emotion I could feel even through the written words. I work with artists from all over the country. I've heard thousands of voices, but I've never heard anything like this. Can I meet him? I read that message 5 times, showed it to Miss Evelyn. We showed it to Gabriel, and he, with that serenity that always left me breathless, said simply, "If my voice can go where I can't, Grandma, maybe that's good." I didn't know if I should trust. The world had already disappointed us so many times. But there was something in that message, something genuine, something that seemed less interested in profit and more interested in preserving something rare. So I replied, said yes, that he could come. And as I pressed the send button, I felt like I was planting a seed. Small, fragile, but alive. And sometimes, that's all we need. A seed and the courage to let it grow, even without knowing what it will become. Marcus Reed drove 5 hours from Atlanta to Savannah on a sweltering Saturday in the summer of 2020. He arrived in the late afternoon, when sunlight came through the windows like melted honey. He was tall, soft-spoken, and the first thing he did upon entering was shake Gabriel's hand, not with pity, not with hesitation, just as one greets another human being. And that, by itself, said a lot about who he was. We went to a small studio downtown, a modest place, with exposed brick walls and equipment that seemed to hold decades of stories. Gabriel sat in front of the microphone. The headphones were too big for his head, sliding slightly to the sides. Marcus adjusted them carefully and said, "When you're ready, you can begin." Gabriel took a deep breath, and then he sang "Can You Hear Me, Mama?" A song he'd composed months before, but that I'd never been able to hear without crying. The lyrics were simple, but devastating. They spoke of a child waiting for a sound that never came, of a voice calling in the dark and finding only echo, of outstretched hands that were never held. And in the chorus, repeated like a prayer, he sang, "Can you hear me, Mama? I'm still here. I'm still here." Double quotes. When he finished, the studio fell silent. Marcus didn't move. He just sat there, hands covering his face. When he finally looked at me, tears were streaming down his cheeks. He didn't try to hide them, just let them fall. "Ma'am," he said, his voice choked, "I've produced Grammy winners. I've worked with music legends. But this this is something else. This isn't just talent, it's truth." He offered a contract, digital recording, independent distribution, fair royalty split, no abusive exclusivity, no hidden clauses, everything clear, everything transparent. I read every word 3 times, asked Miss Evelyn to read it, asked a lawyer friend from church to review it. And then I asked Gabriel, "Do you trust him?" Gabriel tilted his head, thoughtful, and then said, he cried, "Grandma, for real. People who cry for real don't want to hurt." And I realized something in that moment. Trusting wasn't about Marcus. It was about believing that goodness still existed in the world, that not everything was self-interest, that some people could still see value without trying to steal it, that it was possible to be seen without being used. So we signed, and for the first time in years, I allowed myself to believe that maybe, just maybe, the world was ready to listen without taking, to admire without exploiting, to love without conditions. I was wrong about many things, but I wasn't wrong about Marcus. And I wasn't wrong about my grandson's voice, because there was something in it that couldn't be bought, manufactured, or faked. There was truth. And truth, when it's sung, passes through walls that no contract can tear down. The song went viral in a week. It wasn't gradual. It was like a fire no one saw starting, but that suddenly was everywhere. 2 million plays, then 5, then 10. Comments came from places I didn't even know existed. People crying, saying that Gabriel's voice had touched something in them that had been asleep for years, saying he sang what they couldn't say, that the song was theirs too. The invitations began to arrive. Morning shows, podcasts, charity events, magazines wanting to interview the blind and autistic boy prodigy who conquered America's heart. I hated that phrase, because Gabriel wasn't a prodigy. He was just a child who had learned to transform pain into melody, and that wasn't exceptional, it was human, deeply human. Gabriel remained humble. He always was. When the first royalty check arrived, an amount I'd never seen in my bank account, he asked me what we should do with it. I said, "It's yours, my love." He shook his head. "It's ours, Grandma. You stayed." Those 2 words, "you stayed," broke something inside me. Because he was right. I had stayed. Not out of heroism, not out of sainthood, but because true love isn't a single choice. It's a series of small choices repeated every day. It's waking up and choosing again. It's getting tired and choosing again. It's doubting and choosing again. With that money, Gabriel bought a house for us. Small, 2 bedrooms, a porch where we could sit and listen to the wind, and a room with good acoustics, where he could sing without the sound getting trapped in the walls. I cried the day we moved in. Not because the house was big or luxurious, but because it was ours, paid for with love that had been ignored, abandoned, and then resurrected. It was concrete proof that sometimes, when you plant faith in the soil of pain, what grows is something no one expected. But success has a strange way of waking ghosts. And some ghosts don't come back to apologize. They come back to claim what they never planted. And that's where the story, which was already difficult, becomes impossible. Because it's one thing to face absence. It's something completely different to face someone who returns wanting to harvest what they never watered. Laura saw Gabriel on television. She was in Miami at that time, living a life I didn't know and didn't care to know. New boyfriend, new job, new apartment with an ocean view. A life built on forgetting who she'd left behind. She called me 3 days after seeing him on a national talk show. I was making tea when the phone rang. I didn't recognize the number, but something inside me knew. I answered, "Mom." Her voice was shaking. Not with emotion, with shock. Is that really him?" I didn't answer immediately. I let the silence do the work that words couldn't. And then, with a calm I didn't know I had, I said, "Yes, it's Gabriel. The boy you left." Silence on the other end. A heavy silence, full of unsaid things. "I want to see him," she finally said. "No, Mom, please. I'm his mother." I closed my eyes, took a deep breath, and then said the truest thing I'd ever said in my life. "You were his mother. Now you're just someone who remembers him." She hung up. I thought that would be the end. But 2 weeks later, a letter arrived, not from her, from a law firm in Miami. Notice of intent to pursue parental rights and financial guardianship. Cold legal terms describing something that should be warm, alive, human. She wasn't coming back to apologize. She was coming back to take, to claim what she never cultivated, to put her name on something she didn't build. And suddenly, the boy who couldn't see was about to face the ugliest thing in the world. A mother who could see but only looked when there was something to gain. I held that letter in my trembling hands and realized, some battles aren't fought with love, they're fought with truth. And truth, sometimes, needs witnesses, needs proof, needs voice. And we had all of that. We just didn't know yet how much that voice I'd been recording on old tapes for years, would be able to speak louder than any lawyer ever could. Laura arrived on a Thursday afternoon, without warning. I was in the kitchen making the oatmeal cookies Gabriel loved when I heard the sound of a car stopping in front of the house. It wasn't the sound of a common car. It was the soft purr of an expensive engine, the kind of sound that announces someone wants to be noticed. I looked through the window and saw her getting out of the black sedan. Impeccable beige suit, high heels, professionally straightened hair, leather briefcase in hand. She looked like the kind of person you see in bank commercials. Confident, successful, distant. She looked like everything except a mother who had abandoned her son. I opened the door before she could ring the bell. I was still wearing my apron, stained with flour. My hands smelled of butter and cinnamon. I didn't try to fix myself up. I didn't want to, because there was something symbolic in that. She arrived with armor. I was marked with the work she never did. She didn't hug me, didn't ask how I was, just said, with a rehearsed, professional voice, "We need to talk about Gabriel's future." His future, I repeated slowly, letting each word carry weight, not his past. She tightened her lips. That tick I'd known since she was a child, the same one she made when she was about to lie or justify something unjustifiable. I'm here to be part of his life again, Mom. Long-distance co-parenting, legal support for his career, profit participation. He's a minor. He needs proper representation. Co-parenting, legal support, profit participation. The words came out of her as if she'd memorized a script, and maybe she had, because there was no warmth in them, no regret, no love, just interest disguised as responsibility. It was at that moment that Gabriel appeared in the doorway of the piano room. He couldn't see, but he knew someone was there. He tilted his head slightly, listening to the breathing, the rhythm of speech, the cadence of words. "Who is it, Grandma?" he asked, with that calm voice he always used when something made him uncomfortable. I looked at Laura, really looked, saw something that scared me. She didn't seem ashamed. She seemed determined. As if she had every right in the world to be there. As if 10 years could be erased with a well-cut suit and a lawyer's speech. "It's just the past, sweetheart," I said, not taking my eyes off her. It came to listen. Laura flinched, but she didn't leave. Because this time, the past didn't just want to listen. The past wanted to speak. And more than that, the past wanted to collect. Wanted a piece of what it never helped build. Wanted to sign below something it never wrote. And I realized, with painful clarity, that this wasn't going to end there. That we'd have to fight. That truth would have to be defended. Because some people don't believe in truth until it's proven. And some don't believe even after. The courtroom was cold. The kind of cold that doesn't come from temperature, but from impersonality. From walls that were too white. From fluorescent lights that made everything seem lifeless. From the tense silence that filled the space between people. Gabriel was sitting between me and Teresa Monroe, our lawyer. Teresa was in her early 60s, gray hair pulled into a firm bun, and eyes that had seen every kind of injustice the legal system could offer. She'd fought custody battles for over 30 years and had never lost to greed, but she'd also never faced a case like this. Because usually, when a mother abandons, she doesn't come back with a lawyer. She simply stays where she is. Laura's lawyer was young, sharp, expensive. The type who charged by the minute and spoke as if he were always in court, even when he wasn't. He presented evidence. Bank transfer receipts supposedly sent to me over the years. Birthday cards with postmarks, but that I'd never received. A witness, a neighbor from Miami who swore that Laura talked about Gabriel constantly, with so much love. Everything looked authentic, well put together, convincing. Teresa leaned toward me and whispered, "Without proof of forgery, this could go badly." I felt my chest tighten, felt fear rising up my throat like a wave I couldn't control. But then Gabriel held my hand, squeezed gently, and whispered, "Let her finish, Grandma. Truth needs silence before it speaks." I didn't understand at the time, but I trusted. Because if there was one thing I'd learned in all these years, It was that Gabriel understood things the rest of us took a lifetime to begin to comprehend. He knew that truth doesn't need to shout, it just needs to wait for the right moment. And when it arrives, no one can ignore it. Laura took the stand with confidence. She swore to tell the truth. And then she began to speak. Her voice was firm, rehearsed, full of pauses in the right places. She spoke like someone who had practiced each sentence in front of a mirror. "I was always present," she said, looking directly at the judge. "From a distance, yes, but I sent money. I sent letters. I supported his education, his therapy, his music. I made mistakes. I was young. I was scared. But I never stopped being his mother." She didn't look at Gabriel once. Not at me either, only at the judge. Because she knew the judge was the one who decided. And she was playing to win, not to reconcile. The judge seemed moved. I could see it on her face. That expression of someone who wants to believe everyone deserves a second chance. That mothers are always mothers, no matter what happens. Teresa objected twice. Both were overruled. I wanted to scream, wanted to grab that cracked blue mug I'd brought as evidence, and show everyone there that that broken object, but still whole, was more proof than any receipt could be. But it wasn't my turn to speak. Gabriel squeezed my hand again, harder this time, and whispered, "Not yet." The judge turned to him and asked, with a voice softer than she'd used until then, "Gabriel, would you like to say something?" He nodded, stood up slowly, and said, with that calm that always left me breathless, "Can I, after she finishes? Truth needs silence before it appears." There was a murmur in the room. The judge tilted her head, intrigued, and then said, "You can speak now, if you want." Gabriel shook his head. "No, ma'am. She hasn't finished lying yet." The entire courtroom froze. Laura's lawyer stood up, indignant, about to protest, but the judge raised her hand, and for the first time since everything began, she looked at Gabriel, really looked and perceived something the papers couldn't show. Perceived that there was a story there that hadn't yet been told, and that perhaps that story was the only one that truly mattered. Gabriel remained standing. Teresa handed him a small audio device connected to the courtroom speakers. He held it carefully, like someone holding something sacred, and spoke with clarity and calm. "Your Honor, I'd like to play a song I wrote when I was 13. It's called The Woman Who Stayed." Laura's lawyer immediately began to object. "This isn't admissible evidence, Your Honor. This is emotional theater designed to." The judge raised her hand again, more firmly this time, and said something that changed everything. "I'll allow it." Gabriel pressed the button, and the music began. It was just him, his voice, a simple guitar, no production, no artifice, just raw truth, unfiltered, without makeup. The melody was soft, but carried a weight that made the air in the room seem heavier. He sang about hands that trembled when holding the teacup, about a cracked blue mug that was never thrown away, about the sound of keys jingling at 7 in the morning, every day, without fail, about the voice of a woman humming songs he could never see, but that felt like light, about the creaking of a rocking chair, about the smell of oatmeal cookies baking in the oven, about the patience of someone who taught, without rushing, a boy the world called difficult to understand, that he wasn't difficult, he was just different. Every detail in that song was a memory that only the two of us had lived. Every verse was a sonic photograph of moments no one else had witnessed. There was no way to fake that, no way to buy it, no way to claim it, because those memories were ours. And the voice that sang them was living proof that love isn't what you say, it's what you do, every day, when no one is watching. When the music ended, the courtroom was in absolute silence. It wasn't the silence of discomfort, it was the silence of reverence, of recognition, of truth finally being heard. Gabriel turned his face toward the judge and said, with devastating simplicity, "The voice doesn't lie, Your Honor. It remembers what the heart refuses to forget." I covered my face with my hands, not because I was ashamed, but because I was broken in a beautiful way. Because my grandson had just done something I didn't think was possible. He had transformed love into evidence. He had proven, without documents, without purchased witnesses, without receipts, That truth can be sung. And when it's sung with sincerity, it passes through any well-constructed lie. Laura was crumbling. I could see it, even without looking directly at her. She tried to speak, but no sound came out. Her lawyer frantically flipped through papers, as if searching for something that could counter-argue a song. But there was nothing, because you don't refute memory. You don't counter-argue love. You just acknowledge it, or refuse to see. And the judge, finally, had seen. The judge removed her glasses slowly. She cleaned the lenses with a tissue she pulled from her pocket, but it was an automatic, mechanical gesture, as if she needed time to process what she'd just heard. When she put her glasses back on, she looked at Laura, then at Gabriel, and finally at the cracked blue mug I'd placed on the table as evidence. A simple object, broken, but still capable of holding something. Ms. Rivera, the judge began, with a low voice, but clear as water. I've read the documents you presented. I heard your testimony. I saw the receipts, the postmarks, the witnesses. And on paper, everything seems correct. Everything seems legal. But the law doesn't exist in a vacuum. It exists to protect what is real. And what I just heard, ... double quotes. She paused, looking at Gabriel, ... that is real. Laura's lawyer stood up, trying to maintain composure. Your Honor, with all due respect, a song cannot replace legal documentation. Feelings don't? Feelings aren't evidence. I know, the judge interrupted him, but without harshness. There was something different in her voice now, something personal. But memory is. And memory cannot be falsified, cannot be bought, cannot be recreated by someone who wasn't present. She turned to Laura, and when she spoke, it was with a firmness that cut like sharpened truth. Love is not a contract, Ms. Rivera. It's not a receipt. It's not a postmark. Love is presence. It's the sound of keys at 7 in the morning. It's the song written in gratitude. It's the hand that trembles, but never lets go. She pointed slightly at the cracked mug. It's a broken object that someone refused to throw away, because it still meant something. There was a heavy silence. Laura was pale. She tried to speak, but her voice failed. Tried again, but nothing came out. It was as if, for the first time in 10 years, she was being forced to hear her own silence, to recognize the absence she had created, and that now came back to face her. The judge continued, with an almost pastoral calm. Legal custody and financial guardianship remain with Helena Martins. Parental rights will not be reinstated. She looked at Laura with something that wasn't anger, but sadness. You had 10 years, Ms. Rivera. 10 years to come back, to call, to truly write, to show up. And you didn't come. Not when he was learning to deal with the world. Not when he was scared. Not when he needed you. You came now. When he no longer needs you. When he already has someone who stayed. Laura covered her face with her hands. But they weren't tears of regret. They were tears of defeat, of contained anger, of someone who realizes, too late, that there are things that can't be reversed with money or legal strategy. There are things that, once lost, don't come back. No matter how good your lawyer is. No matter how well you dress. No matter how many receipts you present. Gabriel didn't smile, didn't celebrate. He just turned to me, with that serene face, and said quietly, "Can we go home now, Grandma?" And it was in that moment I fully understood. He had already won. Not there, in that cold, impersonal courtroom, but years ago, when he decided to sing about love instead of absence, when he decided to transform pain into melody instead of resentment, when he decided to remember who stayed instead of hating who left. Justice isn't always loud. Sometimes, it's just a boy who can't see, showing the world what it refused to look at. And sometimes, the most powerful truth is the one that doesn't need to be shouted. Because when it's sung, when it comes from the deepest place in the soul, no one can ignore it, not even those who tried to bury it. Laura was indicted for documentary fraud and bad faith litigation. The bank transfers were fake. The postmarks, altered. The neighbor who testified, had been paid. Everything came to light in the following weeks. As happens when lies are exposed to light, they unravel, layer by layer, until nothing remains but naked truth. Her sentence wasn't prison. It was something that, in my opinion, was much harder. 400 hours of community service at an auditory rehabilitation center for children with disabilities. She would have to be present, would have to help, would have to serve children who, like Gabriel, needed patience, understanding, and unconditional love. Things she had never given her own son. Her lawyer tried to appeal. She stopped him. For the first time since everything began, Laura accepted something without fighting. Perhaps because she was tired, or perhaps, and I want to believe this, even knowing I might be wrong, because a part of her, small and hidden, knew she deserved it, that she needed it. That maybe, just maybe, the punishment was also a chance to learn something that life had never been able to teach. Teresa asked me if I wanted to file a civil suit for emotional damages. She said we could win, that Laura should pay for what she did, for the abandonment, for trying to steal what she never planted. But I said no. Forgiveness already cost too much, I told her, with a calm that surprised even myself. I won't charge for it twice, Gabriel agreed, because for him, punishment was never about revenge. It was always about hope. Hope that people can learn. Even those who hurt us, even those who didn't deserve a second chance. But that life, in its strange mercy, still offers. I don't know if Laura learned. I don't know if she looked at those children at the center and saw the son she abandoned. I don't know if she cried alone at night, thinking about everything she lost. I don't know. And maybe I'll never know. But I know we did our part. And sometimes, that has to be enough. Because we can't force anyone to change. We can only choose who we want to be, regardless of who others decided to be. With the legal battle finally over, Gabriel returned to doing what he'd always done best, singing. But this time, he didn't just want to sing for himself. He wanted to create something bigger, something that could help other children like him. Children the world saw as difficult. Children who needed a place where they were understood, not fixed. That's how the Invisible Voices Project was born. A free music therapy and vocal training program for blind and autistic children. Marcus Reed helped with contacts. Miss Evelyn coordinated the curriculum. We got a partnership with specialized therapists. And in 3 months, we had the first group, 8 children, ages 6 to 14, all with stories that broke your heart, but with voices that insisted on singing. Gabriel taught the way I had taught him. With patience, with repetition, without rushing. He told each child, at the beginning of each session, sound is a language, rhythm is safety. And your voice, no matter how quiet, deserves to be heard. I watched the classes from afar, sitting in a corner of the room, and got emotional every time. Because I saw in him something I had never been able to put into words. He wasn't just teaching music, he was teaching dignity. He was showing those children that they weren't problems to be solved. They were people to be heard. The pain had become a musical score. The loss had become a lesson. And love, that stubborn, patient, silent love I had planted during all those years, had become a mission. Not just for us, but for everyone who crossed our path and needed to remember they weren't alone. That their voices mattered. That someone was willing to stay and listen. By the end of the first year, we had 40 children in the program, 40 voices the world had tried to silence, 40 stories that deserved to be sung, and Gabriel, at the center of it all, teaching what he himself had learned the hardest way, that music doesn't judge, that rhythm doesn't abandon, and that sometimes, the only thing a wounded soul needs is someone who stays. 6 months after the trial, I was at the center helping set up the space for a recital. The children were going to perform for their parents for the first time, and everyone was nervous, that good kind of nervous, full of expectation and hope. That's when I saw a woman enter through the side door. No makeup, hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, discreet clothes. She wore a volunteer badge. I froze. It was Laura. She didn't see me immediately. She was looking at Gabriel, who was leading a vocal warm-up exercise with the children. He was laughing, patient, whole. He didn't look like someone carrying grudges. He looked like someone who had found purpose, and perhaps peace. Laura stayed at the back of the room, quiet, hands clasped, just watching. She didn't approach, didn't try to draw attention, just stayed there, like a shadow that doesn't want to disturb the light. When the session ended, Gabriel walked toward the door. He always knew where things were, even without seeing, and stopped. He tilted his head slightly, as he did when he was listening to something important. "You were here today, weren't you, Mama?" he asked, his voice calm, without anger, without accusation. Laura's breath caught. I could see, even from where I was. She brought her hand to her chest, as if needing to hold something that was about to crumble. "Yes," she whispered, so quietly I almost didn't hear. Gabriel smiled, small, careful, like someone offering something fragile. "Did you hear?" "I did." "Good." He didn't hug her. She didn't ask, but something shifted in that moment. It wasn't forgiveness. Not yet. Maybe it never would be, but it was recognition. It was the possibility that, perhaps, after a long time, much silence and much pain, a door could begin to open. Not the door back to what was, because what was no longer exists, but the door to something new. Something small. Something that would need years to grow, if it would grow at all. And sometimes, that's all we can offer. Not complete forgiveness, but the recognition that someone is trying. And sometimes, that's all someone needs. Not absolution, but permission to start trying. Laura continued as a volunteer. She showed up every week, never talked much, never asked for anything, just served, just helped, just stayed. And I don't know if she did it out of guilt, for redemption, or for something she herself couldn't name. But I know she was there. And this time, she didn't leave. And maybe, in the end, that's all forgiveness needs. Not grand gestures, not dramatic declarations. Just presence, repeated, consistent, real. Today I'm 74 years old. My hands shake more than they used to. My knees complain when I stand up too fast. There are days when I forget where I left my glasses, but I never forget the sound of Gabriel's voice echoing through the house every morning. He still lives with me. Not because he has to. He could buy his own house now, could live independently, with assistance, with all the structure the music money brought. But he chooses to stay. "The house isn't the place, Grandma," he told me once, "it's the sound of it. And that sound only exists here." The cracked blue mug is still on the kitchen counter. Gabriel uses it sometimes. Other times, he puts wildflowers in it, small daisies that he asks me to pick from the garden. "It's not about what it holds," he explained, touching the crack with his fingers. "It's about what it survived." And I understood. Because we were that too. Cracked, imperfect, but still capable of holding something precious. On a quiet afternoon, while we were having tea on the porch, I said to him, without thinking much, just letting the words come out, "When I die, I want you to sing The Woman Who Stayed at My Funeral." He was quiet for a long time. So quiet I thought maybe he hadn't heard me. But then he held my hand, those hands of his, no longer a child's, but that still held with the same tenderness, and said, "Only if you promise to stay for a long time still." I laughed. A wet laugh, full of tears I didn't know were waiting to come out. "I promise," I said, and I meant it, because I realized something in that moment. Some loves don't need eyes to see. They just need memory, melody, and the stubborn, silent, unshakable refusal to let go. Even when the world says it's time to go. Even when hands tremble. Even when the body tires. Love that stays isn't spectacular. It isn't dramatic. It's just faithful. And in the end, it's the only thing that remains. The only thing that matters. Gabriel returned to the piano after that conversation. And while he played, I closed my eyes and gave thanks. I gave thanks for the pain that taught me to love truly. I gave thanks for the absence that showed me the value of presence. I gave thanks for the boy who couldn't see, but who taught me to see what truly mattered. Some inheritances aren't possessions, aren't houses or money or contracts. They're sounds, memories, small gestures repeated with so much love that they become eternal. And that was our inheritance. Invisible, unshakable, true. A simple dinner. The table set with care. The cracked blue mug in the center, this time full, not with coffee, but with fresh flowers I brought from the garden that morning. Gentle steam rising from it, carrying the delicate fragrance of jasmine and lavender. Gabriel is sitting at the piano in the next room. I can hear the sound of the keys, not a complete song, just fragments, musical thoughts he's stitching together as night falls. His hands move over the keys like someone speaking a language only he fully commands. A language without words. A language of pure feeling. He stops for a moment and says, softly, to no one and to everyone, "The sound doesn't hurt anymore, Grandma." I close my eyes. Let those words enter. Let them fill me. Because I know exactly what he means. Sound used to hurt. Every unexpected noise. Every unfamiliar voice. Every silence where there should have been presence. But now, sound is just sound. It no longer carries fear. No longer carries absence. It carries only life. Only now. Only us. Later that night, Gabriel performs at a small theater downtown. It's nothing grand. Just an intimate space, with wooden chairs and soft lights. The kind of place where music doesn't have to compete with anything, just exist. I sit in the third row, as I always do. The cracked blue mug is in my purse. I bring it always, not out of superstition, but because it's part of the story, part of us. And as Gabriel takes the stage, I hold it discreetly, feeling its weight, the texture of the crack under my fingers. The audience quiets when he appears. Not because he demands silence, but because something in him inspires reverence. He walks to the microphone without help, without hesitation, just trusting that the space will be where it should be. He sits, adjusts the headphones, and closes his eyes, not because he has to, but because that's where the music lives, in the interior silence, in the place the world can't reach, but where truth has always been waiting. When he begins to sing, the whole world seems to stop, not with pity, not with forced admiration, but with understanding, because his voice doesn't just tell a story, it asks a question that each person in the audience, each person listening, each person who has ever loved and lost and chosen to continue, needs to answer for themselves. What are you willing to stay for? And while he sings, I realize the answer doesn't need to be spoken. It's lived. Every day, in every small choice, in every cup of coffee prepared at the same time, in every melody repeated until it becomes memory, in every hand that trembles, but doesn't let go. The music ends. The silence that follows is sacred. And when the applause finally comes, it's not loud. It's respectful, almost whispered, as if no one wants to break what has just been built. Gabriel smiles, small, serene, and nods slightly, not to the audience, but to the sound, to the presence, to the love that stayed. And I know, with a certainty that needs no words, that it was all worth it. Every sleepless night, every tear, every fear, every doubt, because true love is never wasted, even when it hurts, even when it's not recognized, even when the whole world seems not to see. Because in the end, love that stays doesn't need an audience, doesn't need recognition, doesn't need anything beyond itself. And when it's sung, when it's lived with unshakable faithfulness, it becomes something no absence can erase, something no lie can falsify, something no courtroom can deny. It becomes truth. And truth, when it's sung, can never be out of tune. Blindness didn't limit Gabriel. Autism didn't silence him. They were simply the path destiny chose to amplify what truly mattered, to show that there are things that don't need eyes to be seen, that there are truths that can only be heard when we stop trying to see. I proved that patient love is the truest form of miracle, not the kind that happens in an instant, with thunder and lights, but the kind that happens every day, in silence, without witnesses, without applause. The kind that wakes up early and makes coffee, that plays piano even when fingers ache, that holds hands even when they tremble, that stays, even when it would be easier to leave. Laura learned late, painfully, that you can't claim what you never cultivated. That presence isn't something you can fake with receipts and postmarks. That true love leaves marks no pen can write. And perhaps, deep down, she learned something even more important, that regret doesn't erase the past, but can, sometimes, begin to build a different future. A smaller future, more humble, but real. and the world learns something it keeps forgetting, generation after generation, until someone like Gabriel comes to remind it again. Truth can be silenced, can be muffled, can be buried under layers of well-constructed lies, but it can never be out of tune. And when it's finally sung, when it finally finds voice, no one, absolutely no one, can ignore it. Maybe you've felt this too. The sound of someone coming back too late. The weight of love that stayed when everyone else left. The silent victory of remaining in truth, without needing to shout, without needing to take revenge, without needing to prove anything to anyone but yourself. That's why this story begins with a blind boy who learned to see love through sound, who transformed pain into melody, who took absence and transformed it into presence, who proved, before a courtroom full of people who thought they knew what justice was, that true justice doesn't come from papers or sentences, it comes from the voice. And the voice, when it's true, never lies. It remembers what the heart refuses to forget. Some battles are won without fighting. Some truths are proven without speaking. And some voices, no matter how quiet, are loud enough to change the world. Because in the end, it's not about who shouts loudest. It's about who stayed, who held on, who loved when it was hard, who sang when there was only silence. And that voice that stays, is the only one that matters. It's the only one that lasts. It's the only one that echoes through eternity, long after all other sounds have disappeared. Have you ever forgiven someone who never asked for forgiveness? Have you ever loved someone who only saw your value when the world saw it first? Have you ever stayed when it would have been easier to leave? Leave your story in the comments. You're not alone. And remember, the voice of truth never needs permission to be heard. It just needs courage to sing. If this story touched something in you, something that was quiet, hidden, waiting, subscribe. Share it with someone who needs to be reminded that love that stays always wins. And leave your light here, in this space where pain transforms into wisdom, and memory into peace.